Sure. I know Kevin he'll put it up.
Awesome. Okay, so what you're looking at here is the third in the trilogy about the Americas. It's a graphic narrative because, it's obviously this mural-sized image that tells a story. This one in particular is about resistance to mega development projects in Mesoamerica, which is southern Mexico and Central America. And specifically, it's about resistance to a plan called Plan Puebla Panama, which stretched from Puebla, Mexico to Panama. So both of these images that you see before you are actually part of the same poster project. We have the outside, and then the outside opens up to this inside that you see here. And the reason that we did that was to showcase two drastically different world visions. The outside is a top-down view of the world. From this vantage point, all you can see is the mega development projects that the global capitalists have destined for this region of Mesoamerica. The boats represent imports and exports, both historic and contemporary, and the entire thing is drawn in the style of an old world map. So you see different elements like the compass rose here and different map elements. And that's as an allusion to colonization. Because of course, when we're talking about this form of large development, these are very colonial dynamics that are going on. So in the four corners of this image, we have four different global institutions that are responsible for enabling this form of development. So for example, right up here we have the World Trade Organization. It's drawn and characterized as a faceless judge, as an allusion to the tribunals that the WTO will have to determine whether a country's laws, be they environmental laws, labor laws, or what have you, are barriers to trade. And as you can see in one hand, he has a riot cop hand puppet that's playing pop-a-mole with the various resistance movements. To represent the fact that when the WTO meets, of course, people also converge to resist its policies and they're met with repression. On the other hand, he has this axe symbol with the bundle of sticks. That's a fasci symbol. It's an ancient Roman symbol that was reappropriated by Mussolini. It's where the word fascism comes from. Where the bundle of sticks represents the power of the state to rule the masses, while the axe represents the power of the state to take life. And hanging off the fasces is a balance, where on one hand you can see this gallows, where various native hats, indigenous hats, are hung around nooses. That is being outweighed by the velvet pillow and the top hat to represent the interests of the elite. And of course also to represent that the policies of the WTO are often a death sentence to rural and indigenous communities. Now over here we have the Inter-American Development Bank, which is the largest funder of the Plan Puebla Panama, and is also just like a regional bank, much like the World Bank, but just for the Americas. So here you can see he's illustrated as a half cash register, half conquistador, faceless conquistador. And here we can see there's these paper cutout people that are having a show put on for them by this jack-in-the-box PR guy, showing them PPP, Plan Puebla Panama, with a rainbow and a pot of gold at the end. But you can see these people are really being lined up to be wrung out by those finger puppet politicians. They're being shaken down for their cash, where the coins are turning into pipelines and the dollar bills are turning into roads. At this corner, we have the World Bank, which is like the Inter-American Development Bank, but for the whole world. On one side, you can see he has a slot machine arm to demonstrate that he's gambling with the climate. And with the other hand, you can see he's punching out these chips from the exhaust of an oil refinery, chess piece. And this represents the World Bank's role in the development of the carbon market. So the clean development mechanisms is what the World Bank calls it, but of course this is the commodification and privatization of the land or the air primarily and emissions, which has become a multi-trillion-dollar market with a lot of fraud. And so here he has the halo, that's the fluorescent light. showing the absurdity of this thing that you can just change your light bulbs and avoid climate change, when of course really a much more fundamental system change. Now these chips are falling onto a table, you can see, and these different countries and continents have different levels of chips on next to them. And the ones with the least amount of chips, well, they have a bear trap over them. And this is to signify that these loans are a trap. The World Bank will loan these countries all of this money to develop these huge infrastructure projects. But when the country isn't able to repay that loan, it leaves them vulnerable to outside influence. And the World Bank has its own SAP programs, or structural adjustment programs. But the largest culprit of structural adjustment is the IMF. So this is the International Monetary Fund, illustrated as the faceless surgeon prescribing structural adjustment on this very battered body of Mesoamerica. You can see he's applying leeches and antiquated forms of medicine and extracting oil and water. Basically what the IMF does is, it will offer to rebalance the debt of a country in exchange for gaining control and privatizing key sectors, such as the oil industry, or water. Now, returning to the map, in these old world, colonial maps, you'd often find these guys with big puffy cheeks that would tell you where the storms are. Well, this map also has storms, and they represent a pressure system acting on Mesoamerica. So each one represents a systemic force on its own. In the north, we have the storm cloud of militarization, cultural imperialism, weapons, emissions, and pesticides raining down on Mesoamerica. Whereas in the south, we can see climate change, industrial and economic displacement, and war culminating to create this tidal wave force of migration north. We have the consumerist pressures coming in from the east and west. From Asia, we have the manufacturing cloud, bringing in cheap parts to be assembled in the maquila zones, or the tax-free zones where they set up factories, to be sucked up by the consumer tornado to bring these products that are cheaply made in Mesoamerica to markets in North America and Europe. One of the final elements I'm going to go over today of the outside of this poster is the Mobius strips. These are on either side of the map, and you can see these infinite loops represent vicious dynamics, between repression versus resistance. Or here we have this Trojan horse with the symbols of the oil and food industry on it, to represent, the Trojan horse, or false promise of biofuels. And marching out of the hatch of this Trojan horse, you can see the various conquistadors, each representing an impact of biofuels. The syringe represents genetic contamination. The chainsaw represents deforestation. And of course, this conquistador is holding up a gas pump to this ant that's grinding corn for food. And this represents the new pressure of food versus fuel, and what shall this arable land be used for. Now these Mobius strips are all of my favorite to go over because especially this first one is so fundamental when we're actually talking about colonization as assimilation into capitalism. So, not just assimilation into a nation state or its national identity. So this is about the privatization of land, and it's the story of Farmer Bee. So Farmer Bee starts off in the hive, which is meant to represent collectively held land. In Mexico and places like El Salvador, they were known as ejidos. And one of the reasons that the Zapatistas named themselves after Zapata is because the Mexican Revolution, which Zapata led, was fought for this collectively held land and this land reform. And and NAFTA actually forced the change to the Constitution of Mexico to force this change to allow for the privatization or subdivision of these ejidos. And so, of course, the Zapatistas stepped onto the world stage in 1994 to oppose NAFTA and named themselves after this leader, even though they're Mayans. So here, NAFTA is passed, and Farmer B gets a deed to his very own hexagon of land from the Agriculture Department and a loan from the bank using that deed. Here you can see he's probably farming his own hexagon of land, but the fruits of his labor can't compete with the subsidized imports coming in from the US. So this truck is doing what they call grain dumping, or selling grain at below market value because the farmers that grew it receive subsidies from the government. It's distorting agricultural markets around the world. So now Farmer B has to break his piggy bank to repay the loan, has to sell his land, and is forced into migration, where he, or she I should say, either ends up in a maquila factory, migrating to an urban area where labor is not treated with any respect, or migrating north to work on a farm in either the United States or Canada. And it has been shown that after NAFTA passed, there's this huge influx of specifically this kind of labor. Now, this Mobius connects with this one that starts with the story of this quetzal bird. Now, for those that don't know what the quetzal bird is, it's a very emblematic bird of Guatemala. The dollar is called the quetzal, and I've heard that they used to exchange the feathers as a form of currency. So this quetzal bird is weaving a bird tapestry, which is to say that it's making something of its own culture. But this tapestry is being framed, first by this church, and eventually you can see the tattered threads are being fed into the spools in the sweatshop scene. Where out of the sewing machines is flying this name brand clothing, which is flying into the front door of the shopping mall, which is built on top of the church, which is built on top of the pre-Columbian temple, to represent the phases of cultural imperialism imposed on this region. But the metaphor is also very literal in the sense that many churches were built on temple sites, sometimes from the same stones. Now, this is a kind of depressing view of the world, because what we're examining is systemic, oppressive dynamics. But there's something that you can't see from this perspective, from the top-down perspective. What you can't see is what's happening on the ground. You can't see the people that these projects are impacting. And so that's why we made our image two-sided. So when you open it up, you're confronted with a much different perspective. This is drawn as if you're an ant on one of these buttressed roots, looking up at this giant ceiba tree, which is the tree of life in Guatemala. And spiraling around the ceiba tree like DNA strands are these streams of winged and water creatures. These are the spirit animals. They represent species that are either endangered or extinct from the region, but they also represent the presence of ancestors. And this entire poster project started with a 6-month tour of Mesoamerica, visiting the communities on the front lines of resistance to these mega development projects. And one of the things through our interviews that was emphasized to us over and over again was the need to represent the ancestors. Because people don't see themselves as part of, one isolated struggle against a mine or one isolated struggle against a dam project, but in a generations long struggle against colonization. And so, of course, here we have the ancestors drawn into most of the scenes. Now, also spiraling around the ceiba tree are these ants. And there's over 70 different species of ants on the inside of this poster. There's over 400 different species of animals on the inside. And so this is another juxtaposition. We had the monovision of development versus the diversity of the grassroots. And these ants are carrying these blades of grass, and on these blades of grass are written the Zapatista principles of organizing. And these are actually the Mesoamerican principles of organizing that were merely popularized by the Zapatistas, showing, the Zapatistas came from this long history of resistance within Mesoamerica. And, one of the things about the Zapatistas that's important to remember and I was actually reminded of this in a workshop that I did, is that the Zapatistas were organizing for 10 years before the world knew who the Zapatistas were, before they stepped onto the world stage, before they tried to get media attention for their activities, etc. They were developing their army, the EZLN, with which they eventually militarily occupied 5 cities to declare war against the Mexican government on New Year's Day, 1994, to oppose NAFTA. But they were also developing their own form of direct democracy. And of course, this is something that has been developing since then. They didn't let women into leadership then. That has changed. It's an ever-evolving process. But this ethic, is seen in their principles. So, for example, to propose and not impose, or to convince and not conquer. To walk by asking, or to command by obeying. They seem like, kind of like riddles. But these concepts are very familiar to anyone that's done horizontal organizing or has worked in collectives. This idea that it's the idea that carries forward, and that any leadership that you're given is really respect that you're given because people like your ideas, generally speaking, and it's part of a horizontal way of organizing. Also, others of their principles, one world in which many worlds fit. The Zapatistas are pluralists. They don't identify as anarchists or communists. They are, Zapatistas. And they don't think that everyone should be Zapatistas either. They think that everyone should, find their own way. And they believe in, one world in which one way isn't imposed on everybody else. Now, just to give you an idea of the structure of the inside, nestled in the roots of the ceiba tree are all of these different scenes of culture. So we have, the traditional uses of water, the birthing scene, the fiesta, the encuentro, the solidarity economic scene. And on the edges of the poster is where we find these characters that are drawn in the similar style as the outside. And these are the invaders. And this is the moments where we can showcase both the repression, but also the resistance. And so this is where we have actually put into images many of the stories that we heard. And I'm just gonna stop right there. Is it time for my